You stand at the edge of the clearing as the late afternoon light falls thin and pale across the snow. The air carries that particular quality of cold that belongs only to the weeks just after the solstice, when winter has settled fully into the land and shows no sign of leaving. Your breath rises in clouds that hang suspended for a moment before dispersing, and you can feel the temperature beginning to drop as the sun inches toward the tree-line. It will be dark soon. It will be colder still. You are here to learn something that your ancestors knew in their bones, something that meant the difference between survival and surrender when the snow lay deep and the night stretched long. You are here to understand how winter camps were built, not as we build now, with central heating and insulated walls and the flick of a switch, but as they were built when heat was something precious and finite, when warmth had to be captured, held, cherished like a living thing. When every degree mattered. The clearing where you stand was chosen with care, though to the untrained eye it might seem unremarkable. But you are learning to see as they saw, those who lived through winters without safety nets, and so you notice, the way the land slopes ever so gently downward to the south, creating a natural suntrap during the brief hours of daylight. The thick stand of spruce trees to the north, dense and dark, forming a windbreak against the prevailing storms. The slight rise in the center of the clearing where water will not pool when the thaw comes. The proximity to the frozen stream, visible as a white ribbon winding through the darker shadows of the forest. Everything here was selected for a reason. You kneel in the snow, and even through your gloves you can feel how dry and powdery it is, the kind of snow that falls when the air is well below freezing. This is good snow, in its way, better than the wet, heavy snow that soaks through everything. This kind shakes off. This kind insulates. The people who built winter camps understood snow as we understand the weather forecast, but their knowledge was more intimate, more essential. They could read the snow like a text that told them whether to build today or wait, whether to venture out or stay sheltered, whether a storm was coming from the weight of the sky and the behavior of the birds. Around you, the forest holds its winter quiet. It is not a complete silence. If you listen carefully, you can hear the small sounds that persist even in the deepest cold. The creak of branches rubbing together in the light breeze. The distant tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker searching for dormant insects beneath the bark. The soft whump of snow sliding from an overladen bough. These sounds do not break the silence so much as define it, give it texture and depth. They remind you that winter is not death but dormancy, a season of waiting and preservation. The light continues to fade, turning from pale gold to silver to the particular blue that precedes dusk. You know that once darkness falls completely, the temperature will plummet. On a night like this, in a place like this, without shelter, a person would be in genuine danger. Hypothermia does not announce itself with drama. It creeps in quietly, making you tired, then confused, then sleepy. Your ancestors knew this. They respected the cold not as an enemy, exactly, but as a force that demanded constant attention, constant response. You imagine the people who would have stood where you stand now, perhaps 300 years ago, perhaps 1,000, perhaps longer. They arrived at this clearing after days of travel, following game or seasonal rounds, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. They knew without discussion where the camp would go. They knew without measuring how large to make it, how to orient it, what materials they would need. This knowledge was not written in books. It lived in hands and eyes and the muscle memory of repetition. One of them, call him the one who knows, though he was likely not alone in his knowledge, would have walked the clearing as you walk it now, reading the land. He would have noted the windbreak, the sun exposure, the drainage. He would have tested the snow depth with a staff, checking for the solid ground beneath. He would have looked for deadfall, for standing dead trees, for the materials that would become the camp. And he would have held in his mind a clear picture of what needed to be built, a shelter that could hold heat, that could be warmed with the minimum expenditure of precious fuel, that would allow his people to survive not just one cold night but many. The physics of heat retention, though they would not have called it physics, were understood with absolute clarity. Heat rises. Cold air sinks and pools. Wind steals warmth from any surface. Moisture conducts cold into the body. A large space is harder to warm than a small one. These principles, simple but immutable, governed every decision that would be made in the building of the winter camp. You begin to walk the perimeter of where the camp would have stood, trying to see it as it was before the building began. Just a clearing in the forest. Just snow and trees and cold. The transformation that would occur over the next days or weeks, for these camps were not built hastily, was the result of careful thought married to hard physical labor. Nothing was wasted. Every choice served the single imperative: keep the heat in. The cold is beginning to make itself felt now, despite your modern clothing. You shift your weight from foot to foot, a small movement to generate warmth. This too was part of the old knowledge: stillness in winter is dangerous. The people who built winter camps were constantly in motion during the building phase, their bodies generating the heat that the camp, once complete, would preserve. You think about the irony of this, that the creation of a place of rest required such sustained effort, such expenditure of energy and warmth. Behind you, the sun finally touches the tops of the spruces, and the quality of light shifts abruptly. Shadows lengthen and merge. The blue of the snow deepens. You can feel the temperature dropping, can almost hear the subtle creak of the world contracting in the cold. This is the hour when fires would be lit, when people would gather close, when the work of heat retention would shift from building to maintenance. But you are still in the before time, the time of planning and preparation. You try to imagine the discussion that would have taken place, though perhaps discussion is the wrong word. More likely it was a shared understanding, a communal knowledge so deep it barely needed articulation. The elder women and men who had survived many winters. The strong young people who would do the heavy work. The children who would gather small materials and learn by watching. All of them understanding their role in the creation of shelter. The site, once chosen, would be cleared. Not entirely, the snow would remain, in fact, serving as both insulation and foundation, but cleared of obstacles, of protruding rocks or stumps, of anything that would make the construction difficult. The snow itself would be packed down, trampled by many feet until it became hard and supportive. In this way, the very substance that represented cold and danger became part of the solution, a foundation that would not melt away as long as the temperature stayed below freezing. You bend down and press your gloved hand into the snow. It gives beneath the pressure, soft and yielding. But you know that with time and repeated compression, it would become something else entirely, dense, almost icy, a solid platform that could bear weight. This transformation of snow from powder to platform was one of the first magics of winter camp building, though it was no magic at all, just observation and application of natural principles. Around the clearing, the forest seems to lean in closer as darkness approaches. The individual trees become silhouettes, then suggestions, then simply part of the general darkness. You can still see the white of the snow, glowing faintly in the last light, and this too is something the camp builders would have noted, how snow reflects even the smallest amount of available light, how this can be used to extend the brief winter days, how a camp positioned to take advantage of this reflected light would feel less oppressive during the long dark months. The wind picks up slightly, and you turn your face away from it, instinctively seeking to protect your exposed skin. This simple gesture, turning from the wind, is the foundation of everything that will be built here. A winter camp is, at its most basic, a turning away from the wind, a creation of stillness within the movement of air. Because moving air steals heat with ruthless efficiency, and still air, especially air trapped in small spaces, becomes an insulator. The people who built these camps understood this with their bodies even if they could not explain it in the language of thermodynamics. You find yourself thinking about the word camp, how inadequate it seems for what was built in places like this. We use the same word for a summer tent casually pitched beside a lake, for a temporary stopping place on a hiking trail. But a winter camp was something else entirely. It was architecture in the truest sense, a structure designed to create a specific environment, to modify the hostile exterior into a habitable interior. It was technology, low-tech perhaps by our standards but supremely functional, refined over millennia of trial and error, of successes and failures that were sometimes measured in survival and death. The temperature continues to drop. Your fingers are beginning to feel the cold despite the gloves. You imagine those fingers without gloves, without the synthetic insulation, without the waterproof shell. You imagine those fingers working, cutting, binding, shaping, building, hour after hour in this cold. The people who built winter camps had hands hardened by work and cold, but they also knew the limits of exposure. They knew when to warm themselves at the fire, when to move to generate heat, when to shelter. This constant negotiation with cold was the rhythm of their winter lives. As you stand in the gathering darkness, you understand that you are about to trace a process that was repeated in countless variations across the northern world, anywhere humans chose, or needed, to survive the deep cold. In the birch forests of the north. On the tundra where trees gave way to low shrubs. In the mountains where altitude added its own challenge to latitude. In all these places, people built shelters that could hold heat, and while the details varied with available materials and local traditions, the principles remained constant. Small spaces. Dense materials. Careful attention to wind and drainage. Maximization of insulation. Minimization of heat loss. The story you are about to inhabit is not the story of a single camp or a single people, but rather a composite, a distillation of knowledge that spans cultures and centuries. You will move through the process as if you are there, as if your hands are on the materials, as if your survival depends on getting it right. Because for the people whose knowledge you are borrowing, survival did depend on it. There was no backup plan, no rescue team, no ability to simply leave if the shelter failed. The winter camp, properly built, was the difference between life and death, and this seriousness of purpose informed every decision, every action. You take a breath of the cold air, feeling it burn slightly in your lungs, and you prepare to begin. The light is almost gone now. Soon it will be time to return to your own warm shelter, your own modern comfort. But first, you will walk through the building of a winter camp, step by step, material by material, principle by principle. You will learn what they knew. You will understand how they survived. The forest around you seems to approve of this intention, settling into its winter stillness like a teacher waiting patiently for a student to begin. The snow glows faintly beneath the first stars. The cold presses in from all sides, indifferent and absolute. And in your mind, you begin to build. You stand now at the threshold of understanding, at the edge of knowledge that stretches back through centuries of human survival in landscapes where cold could kill as surely and swiftly as hunger or predator. The morning continues its slow arrival, and you find yourself thinking of those who came before, who looked at winter not as a season to be endured behind thick walls and central heating, but as a challenge to be met with intelligence, observation, and the patient accumulation of wisdom passed from one generation to the next. The camps they built, these temporary shelters against the murderous cold, were not crude assemblies of branches and hope. They were sophisticated responses to thermodynamic principles that would not be formally articulated by scientists for hundreds of years, yet were understood intimately through touch, through trial, through the simple metric of survival. You are learning now what they knew then, that heat retention begins not with the fire, but with the selection of the site itself. Consider the wind. In the depth of winter, wind is not merely uncomfortable, it is the thief of warmth, the invisible force that strips heat from skin and shelter alike with relentless efficiency. A fire burning bright in still air will warm you thoroughly. The same fire in a strong wind becomes almost useless, its heat torn away before it can settle into your bones or the space around you. The first builders of winter camps understood this with a clarity born of necessity. They read the land as you might read a book, interpreting the subtle signs that revealed which places would offer protection and which would leave them exposed. You would have learned, as they did, to observe snow patterns in early winter, the way drifts accumulated on one side of a hill and remained sparse on another, revealing the prevailing wind direction. You would have noted how certain valleys channeled cold air downward at night, creating frost pockets where the temperature could drop far below that of the surrounding hillsides. You would have watched smoke from fires, seeing how it moved through the landscape, finding the natural windbreaks and the exposed ridges. The ideal site sat below the ridgeline but above the valley floor, a middle elevation where cold air would flow past and over rather than settle and stagnate. It nestled against a natural windbreak, a cliff face, a dense stand of evergreens, a ridge of earth that rose between the camp and the direction from which winter storms typically arrived. These were not always easy places to find, and the search for such locations could take hours, sometimes days, as you moved through territory assessing and reassessing, weighing the availability of resources against the promise of protection. When people speak of these camps now, they often picture them in deep wilderness, far from any human presence, but this was not always the case. Sometimes the best locations were used again and again, season after season, generation after generation. You would arrive at such a place and find the subtle signs of previous occupation, fire-blackened stones arranged just so, a slight depression in the earth where a shelter had once stood, a concentration of wood chips where someone had worked green wood into tools or structural elements. These places held memory in their soil. Once the site was chosen, the work of construction began with the gathering of materials, and here again you find yourself confronted with the depth of knowledge required. Not every tree, not every branch, serves the same purpose or possesses the same qualities. The framework of your shelter demands strength and flexibility, young saplings that can be bent without breaking, or straight branches thick enough to support weight but not so heavy as to make the work impossible. You learn the species, willow for its flexibility, spruce and fir for their abundance and workability, birch for its strength in appropriate dimensions. But it is the insulating materials that truly determine whether your shelter will retain the heat of your body and your fire or allow it to escape into the indifferent night. The principles here are simple in concept but require careful execution. You must create dead air spaces, layers that trap stillness, because still air is among the finest insulators nature provides. Moving air carries heat away, trapped air holds it close. In the boreal forests where winter pressed hardest and longest, you would have turned to evergreen boughs, spruce, pine, fir, layering them in overlapping rows like shingles on a roof, each layer catching and holding air in the spaces between needles. The construction proceeded from bottom to top, each new layer overlapping the one below so that rain or melting snow would run down and away rather than penetrating to the interior. The thickness of this layer mattered enormously. A single row of boughs provided some protection, but 3 or 4 layers created a barrier that could genuinely preserve warmth. You can picture yourself gathering these boughs, moving through the forest with purpose, selecting branches with full needles still green and vital. Dead branches have their uses, but for insulation the living or recently cut boughs hold their needles better, maintain their structure longer. Your hands grow sticky with sap, fragrant and difficult to clean, but this stickiness serves a purpose too. The resin itself is somewhat water resistant, adding another small advantage to the shelter's weather resistance. In regions where long grasses grew tall in summer and stood dried and golden through winter, you would have cut and bundled these stems into thick sheaves, then attached them to your framework in the same overlapping pattern. Grass thatch, properly applied, creates a remarkably effective barrier. The hollow stems trap air, the tight bundling prevents wind from penetrating, and the natural oils in many grasses provide a degree of water resistance. You would have needed to gather these materials before the deep snows came, storing them in dry places, preparing for winter's arrival while autumn still offered mild days for such work. The people who lived on the edges of great plains and grasslands developed particular expertise with these materials. They understood that thatch needed to be thick, far thicker than seemed necessary at first thought, because compression and settling would reduce its effectiveness over time. A fresh layer of grass bundles might stand 6 or 8 inches thick, but after weeks of snow load and the simple pressure of time, it would compress to half that thickness. They built with this settling in mind, creating initial layers of almost excessive depth. In the far north, where trees grew sparse and stunted, and grass barely existed, the builders turned to other materials with the same underlying principle: create layers, trap air, block wind. Blocks of snow itself, cut and stacked, form walls of surprising insulating quality. This seems paradoxical at first, building warmth from frozen water, but snow is mostly air, and ice crystals create thousands of tiny barriers that prevent that air from moving. A properly constructed snow shelter can maintain interior temperatures far above the outside air, warmed only by body heat and perhaps a small oil lamp. You would have learned to select the right snow for cutting, not the fresh powder that would crumble and collapse, but the dense wind-packed snow that held together when cut into blocks. You would have used a long knife or saw, cutting rectangular sections that could be lifted and positioned. The construction required a particular kind of spatial thinking, understanding how blocks should angle inward to create a stable dome, how each block supports those around it, how the final cap piece locks the entire structure into place. The entrance of such a shelter sat low, often requiring you to crawl through a tunnel to enter, and this too served the principle of heat retention. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. By placing the entrance below the level of the living space, you created a cold trap, a place where the heaviest, coldest air would settle and remain while warmer air stayed higher, in the area where you would sit and sleep and tend your lamp. This same principle applied to other forms of winter shelters. Entrances faced away from prevailing winds and sat low, often with a second door or baffle inside to create an airlock effect. The shape of the shelter itself reflected an understanding of geometry's relationship to heat. Spherical or dome-like structures minimize surface area relative to volume. Less exterior surface means less area from which heat can escape. The snow dome, the bent pole lodge, the semi-subterranean earth shelter, all tend toward rounded forms rather than angular ones. This was not conscious mathematics for most builders, it was pattern knowledge, the recognition that certain shapes worked better than others, and the replication of those successful forms. Where timber was available, some winter camps featured partially underground shelters, with walls of earth rising several feet around the living space and only the roof structure fully above ground. You would have excavated these spaces during autumn, digging down 2 or 3 feet, removing rocks and roots, creating a level floor. The earth itself, once you descend below the frost line, maintains a relatively stable temperature, cold by human standards, but far warmer than the air above ground in deep winter. Surrounded by earth on 3 sides, with only the roof exposed to the sky, such a shelter benefits from the thermal mass of the earth itself. The roof of such a structure required careful engineering. It needed to support substantial weight. Snow accumulates through winter, and wet spring snow can be remarkably heavy, while also providing thorough insulation. The builders typically created a framework of poles laid across the excavation, then added a layer of bark or hide to create a ceiling, then piled earth over this ceiling, sometimes to a depth of a foot or more. Grass, moss, or sod could be layered on top of the earth. The entry might be a slightly tilted tunnel, angled to prevent direct wind from blowing inside. Living in such a shelter required adjustments in thinking and behavior. The ceiling hung low, you could not stand upright, but this was intentional, keeping the volume of air that needed warming as small as practical. Movement inside happened carefully, in awareness of the structure's materials and limits. The air smelled of earth and smoke and the close presence of human bodies. Moisture was a constant consideration. Your breath alone, throughout a long winter night, released a surprising amount of water vapor into the air, and if this moisture condensed on interior surfaces and then froze, it created problems both structural and thermal. Some builders addressed this by creating interior liners. A second layer of hide or fabric hung a few inches below the roof structure, creating a space where moisture could condense without directly contacting the insulation. These interior liners could be taken down periodically and dried by the fire. In other designs, small ventilation holes near the peak of the shelter allowed the moistest air to escape, though this required careful balance. Too much ventilation and you lost heat, too little and moisture became problematic. Fire placement within the shelter represented another critical decision. In larger structures, the fire could burn in a central pit, with smoke exiting through a hole in the roof directly above. The smoke hole itself was often equipped with adjustable flaps or covers. In calm weather it could be opened wide to allow smoke to escape freely. In high winds or driving snow, it could be partially closed, angled to prevent downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the living space. The people tending these fires developed fine intuitions about the relationship between fire size, smoke production, and ventilation needs. In smaller shelters, particularly those designed for 1 or 2 people traveling through winter landscapes, the fire might be built just outside the entrance, with a reflector wall of stacked stones or logs behind it to direct heat toward the shelter opening. You would lie or sit just inside, warmed by the radiated heat while protected from wind and the full force of the weather. This arrangement allowed you to tend the fire without leaving shelter and created a useful workspace just outside where snow could be melted for water or food prepared. The floor of your winter shelter received as much attention as the walls and roof. Cold radiates upward from frozen ground, and without proper insulation below, you would find yourself chilled no matter how thick your walls or how warm the air. The solution, again, relied on creating layers of insulating material, thick beds of evergreen boughs, piles of dried grass, even layers of bark peeled from birch trees in large sections. Some builders created raised sleeping platforms, wooden frameworks that lifted them several inches above the floor, then layered these platforms with insulating materials. The air space beneath the platform provided additional insulation, and the elevation meant that the warmest air, which had risen from the fire or been heated by body warmth, surrounded the sleeping person rather than pooling uselessly at floor level above them. The bedding itself was as important as the structure. Furs and hides served obvious purposes, but their arrangement mattered. You would place insulating material beneath you as well as over you, perhaps more beneath than above, because the pressure of your body compressed whatever lay under you, reducing its insulating effectiveness. A hide or fur beneath you might compress to a fraction of its original thickness, so you countered this by using multiple layers or combining furs with other insulating materials that compressed less readily. In the coldest conditions, you might have shared sleeping spaces with companions not merely for social reasons but for thermal efficiency. 2 people sleeping close together under shared covers stay warmer than 2 people sleeping separately. Their bodies create a shared warm zone, and the covers trap heat more efficiently around the larger combined mass. This was understood not as comfort but as survival strategy, and the practice shaped social dynamics and cultural expectations in communities where winter camps were a regular part of life. Moisture management extended to bedding and clothing. Sweat and body moisture could dampen furs and fabrics, and once damp, these materials lost much of their insulating value. The careful winter traveler learned to regulate activity to avoid sweating, removing layers before exertion rather than during it, staying slightly cool while working so that perspiration never soaked through to insulating layers. At night, damp clothing or furs would be hung near the fire, close enough to dry but not so close as to scorch or spark. The daily rhythms of winter camp life revolved around heat management in ways difficult to fully appreciate from the warmth of modern life. Rising in the morning meant coaxing the fire back to life from banked coals, a process that required having proper kindling and fuel prepared the night before. You would have gathered extra wood each evening, storing it inside or under cover so that morning's fire building did not require venturing into darkness and cold to search for materials. Gathering firewood itself represented a substantial portion of winter camp labor. Not just any wood would do, you needed dead wood dry enough to burn efficiently, but you also needed it in various sizes: fine kindling, finger-thick sticks for building the fire up, wrist-thick branches for maintaining it, and larger logs for longer burning. Green wood could be used in some circumstances, particularly for creating smoke for signaling or for large logs that would smolder through the night, but efficient heating required dry fuel. You learned to recognize the signs of dry dead wood: bark that had fallen away or hung loose, branches that snapped cleanly rather than bending, wood that felt light for its size. You learned which species burned hot and fast: birch with its oil-rich bark, ash that burned even when not fully dried, and which burned long and steady, like oak, though oak was rare in many northern regions where winter camps were most necessary. You learned that standing dead wood was generally drier than fallen wood, that wood on the south side of trees dried faster, that certain signs, the presence of particular fungi, the pattern of weathering, indicated how long a branch had been dead and how dry it might be. The accumulation of firewood happened constantly throughout the day. When moving through the landscape for any purpose, checking snares, fetching water, scouting, you kept awareness for suitable fuel, gathering it as you found it, bringing back loads whenever you returned to camp. This constant low-level gathering meant you never faced a crisis of depleted fuel, never had to make a long cold expedition solely to find wood. Water presented its own challenges in winter camps. Snow could be melted, of course, but this required fuel and time, melting enough snow to provide drinking, cooking, and washing water for even a small group consumed substantial quantities of wood. Where possible, you would camp near running water that remained unfrozen, though such locations grew scarce as winter deepened and only the fastest-flowing streams and rivers stayed liquid. Ice could be chopped from frozen lakes and streams, and this melted more efficiently than snow, being denser and requiring less volume to produce a given amount of water. The vessels used for melting snow and ice were kept near the fire constantly, a pot of water or melting snow always available. This served multiple purposes. The steam added moisture to the air, countering the extreme dryness that fires created in closed spaces. The warm water was immediately available for drinking or for adding to food, and the thermal mass of the water itself helped moderate temperature fluctuations near the fire. You learned not to pack snow or ice tightly into pots. Loose snow melted more evenly and was less likely to scorch the pot's bottom before liquid formed. Food preparation in winter camps adapted to the constraints of cold and the imperative of heat retention. Hot food was not merely preferred but necessary. Consuming cold food forced your body to expend warmth, raising that food to body temperature. Soups and stews made efficient use of heat and resources, allowing you to extract maximum nutrition from whatever materials were available. Bones could be simmered for hours, extracting minerals and marrow. Dried meat rehydrated in hot liquid became more palatable and digestible. Grains, if available, softened into porridge that provided sustained energy. The fire's heat was used for multiple purposes simultaneously. While the main pot simmered soup, smaller vessels might be heating water for tea or warming stones that would later be wrapped in cloth and placed in bedding to create pockets of warmth for cold feet. Wet clothing dried on frames near the fire while gloves and mittens warmed on rocks close to the flames. This constant multitasking maximized the return from every piece of wood burned. Smoke, for all the attention given to venting it from living spaces, also served useful purposes. It discouraged insects in seasons when they might still be present. It treated hides and leather, making them more durable. It preserved meat, allowing fresh game to be stored for extended periods. Some winter camp designs incorporated dedicated smoking areas, small separate chambers where meat could hang in dense smoke without making the living space unbearable. The psychological dimensions of winter camps and heat retention intertwined with the physical. Long dark months in confined spaces tested human patience and social cohesion. The camps that functioned best were those where patterns and routines created order, designated spaces for different activities, regular schedules for tending fires and preparing food, agreements about ventilation and noise, and the 100 small behaviors that could either ease or aggravate communal living. Stories and songs served purposes beyond entertainment. They marked time, structured the long evenings, created continuity with past and future. The knowledge of shelter building itself was often embedded in narratives, stories of ancestors who survived terrible storms, tales of mistakes made and lessons learned. You absorbed this knowledge not as abstract instruction but as lived experience transmitted through narrative, carrying emotional weight and mnemonic power. The maintenance of winter shelters required constant attention. Snow needed to be cleared from areas where its weight might cause structural damage, but sometimes additional snow was piled strategically to add insulation. Openings and gaps that appeared as materials dried or shifted needed to be patched. The fire pit required management, ashes removed before they choked the fire, stones adjusted as they cracked from repeated heating and cooling. Fuel supplies needed monitoring and replenishment. In some traditions, the winter camp became a place of craft work, the long indoor hours filled with the creation of tools, the repair of clothing and equipment, the working of materials that required patience and fine motor control better suited to sheltered warmth than outdoor cold. Bone needles were crafted, sinew thread prepared, hides softened and cut and sewn into garments. Tools were hafted, points knapped from stone, wood carved into implements. This work kept hands busy and minds engaged through the dark months. The relationship between temporary and permanent structures varied across cultures and regions. Some groups built winter camps they expected to use for a single season, then abandon. Others created semi-permanent structures they would return to year after year, repairing and improving them, accumulating resources nearby, cached firewood, stored food, materials for quick repairs. These seasonal camps became part of a larger pattern of landscape use, points in a network of human presence that responded to the availability of game, the harvest of plants, the social needs for gathering and dispersal. Children growing up in cultures where winter camps were part of annual rhythms learned shelter building not through formal instruction but through participation and observation. They gathered kindling while adults cut poles. They helped layer insulating materials while learning to judge thickness and coverage. They absorbed the principles of heat retention through their bodies, feeling the difference between a well-insulated shelter and a poor one, understanding through direct experience why certain choices mattered. The knowledge was gendered in some cultures, with certain tasks typically performed by men and others by women, though the specific divisions varied widely and survival situations often demanded flexibility. What remained constant was that all members of the community possessed at least basic understanding of the principles involved. Anyone might face circumstances requiring them to build emergency shelter, and ignorance could be fatal. Seasonal variations in winter camp design reflected changing conditions. Early winter camps, built when snow was still light and temperatures merely cold rather than brutal, might be less heavily insulated, more temporary in nature. Deep winter camps, constructed to serve through the coldest months, received maximum attention to detail and insulation. Late winter camps, as days lengthened and temperatures moderated, might be simpler again, or might focus on issues of melting snow and water management rather than pure heat retention. The dissolution of winter camps in spring was itself a process requiring knowledge. Structures that had been packed with snow for insulation needed careful dismantling to avoid collapse. Materials that would be reused, poles, bark sections, particularly good hides, were cleaned and stored. Fire pits were scattered or covered. The site itself was often marked in subtle ways if it would be returned to, or deliberately obscured if concealment was necessary. You find yourself understanding now that heat retention in winter camps was never merely a technical challenge but a comprehensive way of engaging with the cold season, a practice that integrated observation of nature, understanding of materials, social cooperation, physical labor, and accumulated cultural knowledge. The warmth of these shelters was built from more than physical insulation. It was constructed from human attention, care, and the patient application of principles learned through generations of survival. The morning light has strengthened while you have been thinking these thoughts, considering these patterns. The concepts settle in your awareness not as abstract information but as something approaching felt knowledge. You can almost sense what it would be like to construct such a shelter, to live within it through a long winter, to know cold as an intimate adversary against which every detail of your shelter's design represents a considered defense. The past remains past, but its lessons breathe quietly in the present moment, in this calm morning, in your gradual understanding. You stand now at the threshold of understanding, your hands rough with the memory of winter work, your breath still visible in the cold air that surrounds you even in recollection. The principles you've learned, the layering of materials, the careful consideration of wind and water, the ancient wisdom encoded in every structural choice, these principles now demand to be tested, refined, transformed from theory into lived experience. You are no longer merely observing the construction of winter shelters, you are inhabiting the process itself, feeling the weight of each decision as it presses against the need for survival. The morning arrives pale and hesitant, the sun hidden behind a thickness of cloud that promises snow by afternoon. You've been awake since before dawn, listening to the wind test the corners of the structure you've been building, hearing the way it finds the gaps, the weaknesses, the places where heat might slip away like water through cupped hands. Every sound is information. Every draft is a teacher, stern and unforgiving. The winter camp does not tolerate illusion or approximation. It demands precision born of attention, of presence, of the kind of focus that dissolves the boundary between maker and made. You move through the half-built space, checking the joints where willow poles meet spruce beams, where birch bark overlaps with the careful regularity of scales on a fish. Your fingers trace the lashing, strips of rawhide softened in warm water, wrapped tight, allowed to dry into bonds stronger than the wood they hold. This is knowledge that predates written language, that flows through gesture and demonstration, through the patient repetition of movements that have kept people alive for thousands of winters. You are not inventing, you are remembering through your body something your conscious mind never knew it had forgotten. The framework stands now at shoulder height, ribs of a shelter that will eventually curve overhead to form a dome, low and rounded like a sleeping animal curled against the cold. The shape is deliberate, chosen not for aesthetics but for physics, for the way heated air moves within an enclosed space, rising always, seeking escape, needing to be held and circulated rather than allowed to pool uselessly at the apex. You've learned that a pointed roof, however elegant, is a liability in deep winter. It creates a column of warm air that benefits no one, that represents wasted fuel and wasted effort. The dome keeps heat where bodies live, in the breathing space between floor and ceiling, in the zone of survival. You begin now the critical work of creating the inner wall, the first true barrier between the interior warmth and the exterior cold. You've gathered bundles of dried grass, tall stalks that grew in the marshy lowlands during the brief exuberance of summer, now harvested and cured to a golden brown that rustles with a sound like whispered conversation. This grass, common and overlooked, becomes in winter a substance more valuable than many metals. Its hollow stems trap air in 10,000 tiny chambers, and air, when still, becomes insulation, becomes the invisible shield that guards against the cold. You work methodically, weaving the grass between the structural poles, building up layers, creating a mat of vegetation that begins to transform the skeletal frame into something more substantial, more promising. The work requires patience. Each bundle must be positioned to overlap the one below, like feathers on a bird, like shingles on a roof, ensuring that wind cannot find a straight path through to the interior. Your hands remember this rhythm: gather, place, tuck, compress, move on, a rhythm that empties the mind of everything except the task, except the slow accumulation of protection. The older builder, the one who has seen 50 winters and survived them all, works beside you now, his movements economical and sure. He doesn't speak much, but his presence is instruction, his example a text you read with your whole attention. You notice the way he tests each section of wall with his palm, feeling for evenness, for density, for the subtle difference between adequate and excellent. You notice how he occasionally pulls a bundle out and repositions it, unsatisfied with a placement you would have accepted. Perfection is not the goal. Perfection is impossible in materials taken from the wild, in structures built by human hands against the pressure of approaching winter. But excellence is possible, the kind of excellence that means the difference between a cold night and a bearable one, between depleting your fuel reserves and conserving them, between survival and something worse. He pauses to show you a technique for the corners, where the curved wall must fold back on itself, where gaps naturally want to form. He demonstrates how to create a tight bundle, compact and dense, that fills these vulnerable spaces completely. His hands move with a speed that belies his age, twisting and tucking, creating in moments what might have taken you an hour to puzzle out. You watch, you absorb, you attempt to replicate. Your version is clumsier, slower, but it holds, and he nods, not praise exactly, but acknowledgement, which in this context amounts to the same thing. By midday the inner wall stands complete, a golden cylinder of woven grass that has transformed the space inside the frame. You step within it and immediately feel the difference, the way the wind that was constant is now reduced to occasional whispers, the way the grass itself seems to breathe, to create a sense of shelter even though the structure is far from finished. You stand in the center and look up at the still open oculus at the top, where smoke will eventually escape, where a careful balance will need to be maintained between ventilation and heat loss. The light that falls through this opening is softer now, filtered, and you understand in your body why these structures feel like wombs, like the Earth's own embrace. But the inner wall is only the first barrier. The principle of air trapping demands more, demands the creation of a dead air space, that crucial gap between inner and outer walls where cold and warmth meet but do not mix, where the real work of insulation happens in stillness and separation. You begin now to construct the outer framework, a second ring of poles set at a careful distance from the first, creating a gap of perhaps 8 inches, perhaps 10, depending on the severity of the climate, the availability of materials, the time remaining before deep cold sets in. This outer frame requires different thinking. Where the inner wall was about creating a living space, about defining the volume of air that will be heated and inhabited, the outer structure is about armor, about facing the wind and the snow and the relentless cold with materials that can withstand assault. You select heavier poles, thicker branches, pieces that can bear weight because this outer wall will eventually hold snow, will accept the accumulation of winter storms as additional insulation, will wear the season like a cloak. You dig through snow to find the spruce boughs you cut and cached weeks ago, when preparation seemed abstract, when winter was still a theory rather than a pressing presence. The boughs are stiff now with cold, their needles dark green and resilient, and they carry a scent that awakens something deep in memory, something that connects you to every person who has ever built shelter in a northern forest. You begin to thatch these boughs onto the outer frame, working from the bottom up, layering them so that each course overlaps the one below, so that the natural droop of the branches creates a pattern that sheds both wind and precipitation. The work is harder now. The cold has deepened as the day progresses, and your fingers grow clumsy inside mittens that are too thick for fine work but necessary to prevent frostbite. You develop a rhythm of exposure and warming, working with bare hands for a few minutes until the ache becomes a warning, then thrusting them back into mittens, underarms, against the warmth of your own body until sensation returns. This dance with cold is its own kind of knowledge, an intimate understanding of your body's limits and capacities, of the narrow range of temperature in which flesh remains functional. The older builder works on the opposite side of the structure, and you can hear the sound of his labor, the snap of branches being positioned, the soft grunt of effort, the occasional low word to himself in a language that predates the one you speak, words that might be instruction or encouragement or prayer, you cannot tell. The two of you circle the growing structure like planets around a sun, occasionally meeting, adjusting your work to match, maintaining the symmetry that is crucial for even heat distribution, for structural integrity. As the outer wall rises, the character of the shelter begins to fully reveal itself. Where before there was transparency and potential, now there is mass and definition. The space between the walls, that gap you've been so careful to maintain, begins to declare its importance, begins to function even before the structure is complete. You can feel it when you step inside, the way the wind that buffets the outer surface doesn't penetrate to the inner sanctum, the way temperature begins to differentiate between exterior and interior, the first hint of what this place will become when fire is added to the equation. But the creation of dead air space requires more than mere separation. It requires sealing, requires attention to the places where the two walls meet the ground, where cold air can creep in from below, undermining all the work above. You've prepared for this with materials gathered from the lakeshore, bundles of cattails, their brown cigar-shaped heads still intact, their long leaves dried but flexible. You create a thick ring of this material around the base of the shelter, packing it between the walls where they meet the earth, creating a seal that is both insulation and barrier, that prevents the kind of draft that rises from below to steal warmth from sleeping bodies. The cattail packing requires you to lie on your side in the snow, reaching into the gap, pushing the material as deep as it will go, compressing it until your arms ache with the effort. It's uncomfortable work, cold and awkward, the kind of labor that makes you question every choice that brought you to this moment. But you understand now, in a way you couldn't have understood when you began, that comfort is not the goal of this work. The goal is efficacy, is function, is the creation of a space that will keep you alive through conditions that can kill with casual indifference. Every moment of present discomfort is an investment in future survival, every ache a down payment on warmth yet to come. You emerge from this work covered in snow and bits of vegetation, your clothes damp with perspiration despite the cold, another lesson in the complex relationship between effort and temperature, between the heat your body generates through labor and the cold that waits to claim that heat the moment you stop moving. The older builder gestures for you to follow him away from the structure, and you walk together toward the tree line where a small fire has been maintained throughout the day, tended by others in the camp, a communal resource that represents one of the fundamental truths of winter survival, that fire tending is too important to be left to chance, too vital to be interrupted by other tasks. You warm yourself by the flames, and the older builder begins to speak, his voice low and measured, about the next phase of construction, about the materials that will form the outermost layer of the shelter. He talks about bark, not the thin decorative bark of birch, but the thick, shaggy bark of cedar and elm, pieces that can be harvested in large sheets, that overlap and interlock, that create a surface that sheds water and resists wind, that forms the final barrier between the carefully constructed interior and the harsh exterior world. He explains that bark selection is an art in itself, that not all bark is equal, that the best pieces come from trees of a certain age, harvested in a certain season, prepared in a certain way. He talks about the need to soak bark in the lake, weighted down with stones, until it becomes pliable enough to bend without cracking, flexible enough to conform to the curves of the structure. He describes how bark must be attached with particular care, how the grain must run vertically to shed water, how each piece must overlap its neighbor by at least 4 inches, how the whole assembly must be secured with additional lashing to prevent wind from working underneath and peeling it away. You listen, and the fire warms the front of your body while your back remains cold, and you understand that you are receiving knowledge that cannot be found in books, that exists only in the memories of people who have needed it to survive, who have tested it against the absolute standard of winter and found it sufficient. This knowledge is being offered to you not as gift but as responsibility, as something you will be expected to use, to preserve, to pass on when the time comes and you are the one with experience facing those who have only theory. When you return to the structure, the afternoon light is already beginning to fade, the short winter day asserting its dominance, reminding you that time is a luxury you do not possess in abundance. You work faster now, driven by the approaching darkness, by the knowledge that certain tasks must be completed before night falls and cold deepens beyond the merely uncomfortable into the genuinely dangerous. The bark you've been soaking has been hauled up from the lake, sheets of it stacked near the shelter, still dripping, dark with water and heavy with potential. You take a piece in your hands. It's larger than you expected, perhaps 4 feet long and 3 feet wide, curved from its time on the tree, rough on one surface and smooth on the other. The older builder shows you how to position it on the outer wall, smooth side out to shed water, rough side in for better grip and adhesion. He demonstrates the lashing technique, using long strips of rawhide that have been kept flexible in a pot of warm water near the fire, threading them through holes he creates with a sharp bone awl, pulling them tight, creating a bond that will hold through wind and snow and the expansion and contraction that comes with freezing and thawing. You attempt to replicate his technique, and your fingers fumble with the unfamiliar tools, the awl slipping, the rawhide tangling, the bark refusing to sit quite where you want it. But you persist, and slowly, inexorably, the work begins to take shape. Each piece of bark you add makes the structure more substantial, more real, transforms it from a skeleton into a body, from potential into actuality. You develop a rhythm, position, pierce, thread, pull, secure, move on, and the rhythm becomes meditation, becomes the kind of work that occupies hands and body while allowing mind to drift into a state that is both relaxed and intensely focused. Night falls, and you work now by firelight, by the dancing illumination of torches that have been planted in the snow around the perimeter of the structure. The flames create a world of moving shadows, of exaggerated forms, and the work takes on a different quality, more intimate somehow, more connected to ancient practices, to the countless generations who built their shelters by just such light, who raced against darkness and cold with tools barely different from the ones that occupy your hands now. The outer bark layer grows, course by course, ring by ring, spiraling upward from the base toward the apex. The work grows more difficult as you climb higher, requiring crude ladders fashioned from poles, requiring balance and care as you perch on uncertain footing, reaching up to position bark that wants to slip and fall, that challenges your strength and coordination. But the challenge is satisfying in a way that easier work would not be, the difficulty itself proof that what you're creating has substance, has weight, has meaning. By the time you step back to examine the nearly complete outer wall, full darkness has settled over the forest, and the structure stands transformed, solid and purposeful, its curved form barely visible against the snow except where firelight touches it, creating a play of texture and shadow that makes it seem almost alive, almost breathing. You realize that what you're looking at is no longer just materials assembled, it has crossed some threshold into being an entity unto itself, a shelter, a winter camp, a place that will hold life against the siege of cold. But even with 3 layers complete, inner grass wall, air space, outer bark shell, the structure is not finished. The principle of maximum heat retention demands attention to details that might seem minor but which compound, which add up, which together make the difference between a shelter that merely exists and one that truly functions. You turn your attention now to the entrance, to that necessary compromise between accessibility and protection, that gap in the armor that must be carefully managed if all the other work is to have meaning. The older builder has been constructing the entrance tunnel while you worked on the walls, and you join him now to observe his method. The tunnel extends from the main structure for perhaps 6 feet, creating a horizontal passage that forces anyone entering or leaving to crawl, to bend low, to pass through a transitional space that serves multiple purposes. The low roof of the tunnel ensures that warm air from the main chamber cannot easily escape, heat rises, and the tunnel's design prevents that upward movement from finding an exit. The length of the tunnel creates a baffle, a barrier against wind that might otherwise blow straight into the living space. And the tunnel's floor is dug below the level of the main chamber, creating a cold sink, a place where the coldest air naturally settles and remains, prevented by its own weight from rising into the warmer space above. You help position the final poles that frame the tunnel, that define its walls and ceiling. These are covered with the same layering of materials used on the main structure, inner grass, outer bark, every gap sealed, every potential leak addressed. But the tunnel requires additional considerations, additional features that speak to the accumulated wisdom of winter living. A second entrance is created halfway along the tunnel's length, a small opening that can be covered with a hide flap, that allows people to enter or exit without necessarily exposing the main chamber to exterior cold, that provides ventilation when needed, that offers an emergency exit if the main entrance becomes blocked by drifting snow. The entrance flap itself is a marvel of simple engineering, a piece of caribou hide thick and supple, attached at the top with a wooden rod that allows it to hang freely, that allows it to be lifted and dropped with ease even when hands are full or coordination is compromised by cold. The hide is large enough to overlap the opening on all sides, preventing drafts, but not so large that it becomes unwieldy. Its placement and construction have been tested by generations of use, refined through trial and error into a form that represents optimal compromise between competing needs. You work through the night, though work and rest begin to blur, begin to merge into a continuous present where time is measured not by clock but by task, where completion of one element flows directly into beginning of another. At some point food appears, a pot of stew thick with meat and root vegetables, kept hot by the communal fire, ladled into wooden bowls that warm your hands as you eat. The stew itself is a lesson in winter survival, dense with calories, with fat that your body will burn to maintain temperature, with nutrients that will repair tissue damaged by cold and effort. You eat slowly, mechanically, fueling yourself not for pleasure but for function, understanding food now as a kind of construction material, as necessary to building warmth as grass and bark and careful attention. When the outer structure is complete, when every surface has been covered and sealed, when the bark overlaps precisely and the lashing holds firm, you turn to the final element of heat retention, perhaps the most important element of all, the roof cap, the covering for the smoke hole, that delicate balance between ventilation and heat loss that will determine whether the shelter is comfortable or merely adequate. The smoke hole cannot be sealed entirely, fire requires oxygen, and people require air, and the accumulation of smoke without outlet would make the space uninhabitable. But neither can the hole be left fully open, allowing heat to pour out into the night sky like water from an uncorked vessel. The solution is elegant in its simplicity, a design that has been used in various forms across countless cultures who faced similar challenges. For flaps of bark are attached around the smoke hole, positioned on a framework that allows them to be adjusted from inside the shelter using long poles, allowing the size of the opening to be increased or decreased depending on fire size, wind direction, and temperature needs. In calm weather, the flaps can be drawn nearly closed, leaving only a small gap for smoke to escape. In windy conditions, they can be positioned to create a Venturi effect, using the wind itself to draw smoke out while preventing downdrafts that would blow it back into the living space. You practice adjusting these flaps with the long poles, learning the feel of them, the resistance, the way small movements create large changes in draft and smoke behavior. The older builder watches and corrects, showing you how to read the smoke, how to interpret its color and density and movement as information about fire health and ventilation adequacy. White smoke rising straight and steady, good fire, good draft, proper balance. Gray smoke hanging low and curling, insufficient draft, flaps need opening. Dark smoke pouring out, fire is receiving too much air, burning too hot, consuming wood faster than necessary. This reading of smoke becomes another language, another text you must learn to interpret if you are to live successfully through winter. The shelter will tell you what it needs, but only if you learn to listen, only if you develop the sensitivity to notice subtle signs, to respond to small changes before they become large problems. The adjustment of smoke flaps is not a task you do once and forget, it is ongoing, constant, a conversation with wind and fire and the shelter itself that will continue through every day and night of cold season. As dawn approaches again, a second dawn, though you've lost precise track of time in the continuous cycle of work, the shelter stands complete in its essential form. Every element is in place, the dome framework that defines the space, the inner grass wall that creates the first barrier, the dead air gap that insulates through stillness, the outer bark shell that faces the weather, the entrance tunnel that baffles wind and traps cold, the adjustable smoke hole that maintains the crucial balance between ventilation and heat retention. What remains now is the final test, the proof of all this labor and accumulated knowledge, the moment when fire is introduced and the shelter's true performance is revealed. You gather with the others around the entrance, and there is a quality of ceremony to this moment, an acknowledgement that what happens next matters, that the transition from built to inhabited is significant. The older builder enters first, crawling through the tunnel with a burning brand carried carefully, and you follow, emerging from the low passage into the main chamber that until now has been only potential, only empty space awaiting activation. Inside, the darkness is profound, broken only by the small flame the older builder carries. He moves to the center of the space where rocks have been arranged in a circle, where tinder has been laid ready, and he begins the careful work of starting the fire that will transform this shelter from structure into home. You watch as flames take hold, as light begins to press back against darkness, as smoke rises, hesitantly at first, searching for the exit, then with more confidence as the draft establishes itself and the flue begins to function as designed. The fire grows, fed carefully with small sticks, then larger pieces, building heat gradually rather than all at once. And you begin to feel it, the first subtle warming of the air around you, the slight easing of the cold that has been your constant companion. It's barely noticeable at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or wishful thinking. But it continues, building as the fire builds, and you realize that the temperature inside the shelter is genuinely rising, that the multiple layers of insulation are holding the heat, that the curved walls are reflecting warmth back toward the center, that all the principles you've learned and applied are working together as they were meant to. You remove your outer mittens, an act that would have been unthinkable an hour ago outside, and your hands begin to thaw, to remember what warmth feels like. The older builder sits across the fire from you, his face illuminated from below, rendered into planes of light and shadow, and he is smiling, just slightly, with satisfaction but also with something else, recognition perhaps, or acknowledgement that you have crossed a threshold, that you understand now in your body what it means to build for heat retention, what it means to create shelter that functions not just adequately but well. The fire settles into a steady burn, the smoke rises cleanly through the hole at the apex, and the shelter around you seems to embrace the warmth, to hold it close, to refuse to let it escape into the indifferent cold beyond the walls. You sit in this warmth you have created, this pocket of survival carved from winter itself, and you understand that shelter is not just about materials and techniques, it is about knowledge transformed into action, about attention paid to detail, about the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has faced these challenges before and found solutions worth preserving, worth passing on. worth the considerable effort required to implement them correctly. The morning light begins to filter through the smoke hole, pale and indirect, and by this light you examine the interior space you've helped create. The grass walls glow golden, translucent almost, backlit by the dawn. The curved ceiling seems higher than it actually is, the dome creating an impression of spaciousness despite the shelter's modest actual size. The floor, covered with spruce boughs laid thick and soft, promises comfort for sleeping, for sitting, for the long hours of winter darkness when activity gives way to rest, to story, to the slow maintenance of warmth against the persistent cold outside. You remain in this space throughout the morning, tending the fire, adjusting the smoke flaps as the wind shifts, learning the shelter's personality, its quirks, the ways it responds to different inputs. You discover that the temperature remains remarkably stable, that once the initial cold mass has been driven from the interior, only a modest fire is needed to maintain comfort, that the insulation works as well to keep heat in as it worked to keep cold out. This efficiency is crucial. It means fuel consumption will be manageable, that the wood you've gathered and cached will last through the season, that you will not be forced into the dangerous necessity of cutting and hauling in the worst weather, in the depths of cold when such work becomes not just difficult but potentially fatal. The shelter breathes around you, a living thing in its way, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, settling into itself, finding its final form. Small adjustments are needed, a draft from one corner that requires additional packing, a slight smoke leak where bark hasn't quite overlapped correctly, minor issues that are addressed quickly, that do not diminish the overall success of the construction. You make these adjustments with care, with attention, understanding that even after the main building is complete, the work of maintenance begins, the ongoing conversation with the structure that will continue throughout its use. By afternoon, others from the camp come to observe, to inspect, to offer commentary and approval or gentle suggestions for improvement. This communal examination is part of the process, the way knowledge is shared and refined, the way individual effort is supported by collective experience. The shelter is judged not just functional but well-made, built to principles that have proven themselves over countless winters, adapted to this particular site with intelligence and care. There is satisfaction in this judgment, though satisfaction itself is quiet, internal, not displayed or celebrated with excess but acknowledged with nods and brief words that carry weight precisely because they are spare. You emerge finally from the shelter into the afternoon cold, and the difference strikes you with physical force. The air outside feels brutal after the comfort within, a reminder of what the walls are holding back, of the work they are doing invisibly, constantly, without fanfare or complaint. You understand now, in a way you could not have understood before this experience, why winter camps were built with such care, with such attention to every detail of heat retention, with such unwillingness to accept approximation or shortcut. The stakes are absolute. The cost of failure is measured in suffering and death. The reward for success is continued life, is survival until spring returns and the world remembers warmth. You stand looking at the structure from outside, seeing it now with different eyes, with the eyes of someone who knows intimately how each layer was constructed, who understands the reasoning behind every choice, who has felt in their own body the effectiveness of these ancient techniques. The shelter sits low against the snow, barely taller than a standing person, unobtrusive and unimpressive to casual observation. But you know what it represents, the accumulated wisdom of generations, the careful observation of natural principles, the transformation of common materials into sophisticated technology, the assertion that humans can survive and even find comfort in conditions that would seem to forbid life. The wind picks up as evening approaches, and you watch the shelter face it, unmoved, untroubled, its streamlined dome shape offering minimum resistance, its multiple layers preventing the wind from penetrating to the core. Snow begins to fall, light at first, then heavier, and you watch as it accumulates on the outer bark surface, adding yet another layer of insulation, fulfilling the design that anticipated this, that planned to use winter itself as additional protection against its own severity. You will sleep in this shelter tonight, and in many nights to come, and you know now that sleep will be possible, that rest will be genuine rather than the shallow, cold interrupted half-consciousness that comes from inadequate shelter. You know that the fire will burn steady through the darkness, that the smoke will rise and escape as designed, that the heat will hold and circulate and maintain life through the deepest cold. You know this not as theory but as experienced fact, as something your body has learned through the work of building, through the hours of attention and effort that have taught you what shelter truly means in this place, in this season, in this unforgiving and magnificent landscape that demands your best and rewards excellence with the most fundamental gift, the continuation of life itself. You wake before dawn on the coldest morning yet, and the air inside the shelter holds you like something alive. The darkness is complete, heavy, and for a moment you lie still beneath the caribou hide, listening to the breathing of the others around you, slow, steady, the rhythm of bodies conserving warmth through the night. Your own breath rises in a cloud you cannot see but can feel dissipating against your face, and you know without looking that frost has formed on the inside of the upper walls where the warmth of 7 sleeping bodies met the brutal cold pressing in from outside. The old woman is already awake. You hear the whisper of her movement, the soft displacement of air as she shifts near the fire pit, and then the faint scrape of her hands working tinder. She does not speak. She does not need to. In the weeks you have spent here, you have learned that the first voice of morning belongs to the fire, not to any human throat. You wait, listening to her careful preparation, the gathering of the birch bark shavings you all spent part of yesterday evening preparing, the arrangement of the smallest twigs in a structure so delicate it seems to exist more as idea than object. The strike of the fire steel against flint comes as 3 clear notes in the darkness, sharp, precise, without hurry. Then a pause. Then 3 more. On the 5th attempt, you see the glow, a single point of red in the absolute black, growing as she leans close and breathes into it, her exhalation controlled and steady, feeding oxygen without overwhelming the fragile ignition. The light spreads through the tinder, and shadows begin to move across the walls, the stretched hides, the woven willow framework beneath them, the tools hanging from the structural posts, the sleeping forms of the others beginning to stir. You rise slowly, careful not to disturb the arrangement of furs that has kept you warm through the night. The cold air touches your face first, then your hands as you emerge from beneath the hides, and the temperature difference is so pronounced it feels like stepping between worlds. But the shelter itself, the space you have all created and maintained, is still far warmer than the outside, and you can feel this in your bones, in the way your body does not seize up, does not clench against cold that would be dangerous, deadly even, without these walls. The fire grows. The old woman adds slightly larger sticks now, building the structure upward, and you move to help her, reaching for the cache of wood you all brought in yesterday before the sun set. Each piece has been selected for its properties, wood that burns hot but not too fast, wood that produces minimal smoke, wood that has been dried near the fire for days so that it contains almost no moisture. You hand her a piece, and she nods without looking at you, placing it at precisely the angle that will allow the flames to climb its length while maintaining the flow of air beneath. The man who taught you to read snow wakes next, then the younger woman, then her brother, then the quiet man who seldom speaks but whose hands are always busy with work. The eldest hunter remains sleeping a few minutes longer. He has earned this rest, and no one disturbs him. Each person rises and immediately begins a task, checking the door seal, adjusting the hides that may have shifted in the night, preparing the birch bark containers for melting snow into drinking water, laying out the tools needed for the day's work. No one speaks of the cold that waits outside. No one needs to. You have all felt it growing over the past several days, the way the air itself seems to harden, the way sounds carry differently, the way even the smoke from your fire seems reluctant to rise, as if the atmosphere has become something thicker, more resistant. This is the cold that kills, that finds every gap and flaw, every moment of carelessness or fatigue. This is the cold that the shelter was built to resist, and today you will see exactly how well that construction holds. The light grows inside the space as the fire strengthens, and you can see now the evidence of last night's thermal battle, the frost patterns on the upper portions of the inner walls, delicate and beautiful, following the lines where cold penetrated deepest before being stopped by the layers of hide and the dead air spaces you all worked so carefully to create. The lower walls, near where the bodies slept, show no frost at all. Here the heat was sufficient to prevent any moisture from condensing, kept warm by the presence of life and the rising warmth of the fire and the insulation of the banked earth that surrounds the lower portion of the structure. You eat a small breakfast of dried meat and fat, chewing slowly, letting your body wake fully before the work begins. The old woman prepares spruce needle tea, steeping the green tips in water heated to just below boiling, and the scent fills the shelter, sharp, resinous, alive. She serves it in wooden cups, and you hold yours with both hands, feeling the warmth transfer through the wood into your palms, your fingers, the sensation both pleasant and purposeful. Every measure of heat matters. Every exchange of warmth is managed. When the eldest hunter wakes, he lies still for several minutes, his eyes moving across the shelter's interior, assessing. You have learned to recognize this morning evaluation, the way he checks each element without moving, cataloging the night's performance through observation alone. Finally he rises, and the old woman hands him tea without a word. He drinks, nods, and speaks his first sentence of the day: "We seal the upper gaps today." Everyone understands. The frost patterns have revealed where the shelter's defenses are weakest, where convective currents have found channels through the insulation, where heat is escaping despite your best efforts. These are not failures, they are inevitable in any structure pushed to such extremes, but they are also not acceptable. The cold that is coming, that is already here, requires perfection, or as near to perfection as human hands can achieve. The work begins after the sun rises, though inside the shelter you perceive this only as a subtle change in the quality of darkness at the smoke hole, a graying rather than true light. The man who taught you to read snow goes outside first, moving through the entrance tunnel with the ease of long practice, and you follow, carrying tools and materials, bundles of dried grass, strips of hide, precious packets of animal fat rendered down and saved for sealing work. The cold outside is staggering. It strikes you like a physical blow, stealing breath, making your eyes water instantly, and you understand immediately why the eldest hunter has made this the priority. This is not the cold you have known before. This is something older, more absolute, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak beneath your feet with every step, that makes exposed skin hurt within seconds, that turns breath to ice crystals in the air before you. You move quickly around the shelter's exterior, and now you can see what you could only feel from inside, the thermal landscape of your small fortress. Where heat escapes, the snow has melted slightly and refrozen, creating glazed patches. Where insulation holds firm, the snow lies undisturbed, light and powdery. The pattern tells a story of invisible rivers of warmth finding their way out, and your task is to dam those rivers, to turn them back, to keep the heat inside where the people are. The work requires removing outer layers of snow, examining the hide covering, finding where seams have separated slightly, where wooden framework has shifted, where the materials themselves have contracted in the cold and opened gaps that did not exist when the temperature was less severe. You work with bare hands when precision is needed, and the cold bites deep within seconds, forcing you to warm your fingers against your body, inside your clothing, before returning to the task. Each repair is small, a thumb's width of space packed with grass, a seam re-sewn with sinew, a coating of fat applied to create an airtight seal, but together these small corrections will mean the difference between a shelter that maintains life and one that allows death to seep in slowly, degree by degree, through the long night. The younger woman works beside you, her movements efficient and practiced, and you fall into a rhythm together: identify, repair, move on, identify, repair, move on. The sun climbs but provides no warmth. It is a pale disk in a colorless sky, more concept than presence, and you wonder, as you have wondered before, how people learned these things, how the first humans to face such cold survived long enough to discover the principles you are now applying. Back inside, after an hour of outside work that feels like many more, your body remembers warmth as something almost foreign. The shelter receives you like an embrace, and you stand near the entrance for several minutes, letting the temperature differential work its way inward through your layers of clothing, feeling your fingers and toes begin the painful process of truly warming. The fire burns steady in its pit, and the old woman has prepared more tea, and you drink it gratefully, holding the cup until it cools, unwilling to surrender any source of heat. The eldest hunter goes out next with the quiet man, checking your work, adding their own corrections, and this is how the morning passes. Rotations of labor, everyone working both inside and outside, no one staying in the bitter cold longer than necessary. The shelter always tended by at least 2 people who maintain the fire, prepare food, manage the internal environment. This rotation is itself a technology, you realize, a way of spreading the hardship, preventing any one person from becoming dangerously cold, maintaining the group's overall capacity for work. By midday you have sealed every gap you can find, reinforced every questionable seam, added extra layers of snow to areas where the wind seems to strike with particular force. The shelter looks different now, more organic, its edges softer where you have mounted snow, its surface more textured where you have added materials. It looks less like something built and more like something grown, a natural formation adapted perfectly to its purpose. Inside, the improvement is immediate. The draft you never quite consciously noticed, a slight movement of air near the eastern wall, has stopped. The cold that seemed to emanate from certain sections of the wall has diminished, pressed back by the improved insulation. The fire, which had to be maintained at a certain level just to hold the interior temperature, now achieves the same warmth with less fuel. These differences are small, but you have learned that survival in such conditions is entirely a matter of small differences accumulated, of margins measured in degrees and hours, and the efficiency of resource use. The afternoon is devoted to interior improvements, adjustments that seemed less urgent before but now, with the shelter's exterior defenses maximized, become important. The sleeping platforms, raised areas along the walls where each person's furs are laid, are checked for drafts from below, and where necessary, more insulation is added beneath them, dried grass, small branches, anything that creates dead air space between the sleeper and the cold earth. The eldest hunter explains, as he works on his own platform, that heat always moves from warm to cold, that your body lying on the ground will warm the ground and cool itself, but a body separated from the ground by a layer of trapped air will stay warm all night. You rebuild your own sleeping area using this principle more carefully now, creating a thicker base layer, ensuring that no part of your bed makes direct contact with the ground. You test it by lying down, feeling the difference immediately. The cold that used to seep up from below is gone, blocked by the cushion of air you have trapped beneath you. It seems almost magical, this barrier of nothing, but you know it is not magic, it is physics, it is ancient knowledge encoded in practice, it is the accumulated wisdom of people who studied heat and cold with their bodies as instruments, their survival as the measure of correctness. The old woman works on the door, that most vulnerable point where the entrance tunnel meets the main shelter. She has spent time thinking about this, you can tell, planning an improvement that she now implements with careful deliberation. She hangs an inner door curtain, a large piece of hide suspended from a wooden frame, that creates an additional airlock, a second barrier between the tunnel and the living space. When someone enters or leaves, this curtain can be closed immediately after they pass through, preventing the cold air that follows them from penetrating into the shelter proper. It is a simple innovation, but watching her install it, you understand how much thought has gone into the design, the height at which it hangs, the weight of the hide that allows it to fall closed on its own, the smoothness of the wooden frame that prevents snagging. Evening comes, and the temperature outside continues to fall. You can sense this without going out, can feel it in the way the shelter seems to contract slightly, in the way frost begins forming again on the uppermost parts of the interior walls despite all your improvements. The cold outside has become profound, absolute, the kind of cold that folklore speaks of, that carries names in languages you do not know, that marks itself in the memories of survivors as something almost alive in its hostility. But inside the shelter, with all the day's improvements implemented, the warmth holds. The fire burns in its pit, fed carefully, never allowed to become too large, which would waste fuel, or too small, which would allow the temperature to drop. The smoke rises through the hole at the center of the roof, and almost no heat escapes with it because of the baffles you have placed, the careful channeling that sends smoke up but reflects heat back down. The walls, with their multiple layers and sealed seams, contain the warmth generated by fire and bodies, and the floor, raised and insulated, prevents that warmth from draining into the frozen earth. You eat dinner together, all 7 of you sitting in a rough circle around the fire, and the meal is more substantial than breakfast was, meat cooked slowly in its own fat, roots that were gathered months ago and stored in a cache, more spruce tea, and for each person, a small portion of dried berries that provide sweetness and something the body needs, some element that prevents the weakness that comes from eating only meat through the long dark. The eldest hunter portions out the food with care, ensuring that each person receives according to their needs and their labor, and you notice that he gives himself no more than anyone else. That hierarchy in this place is defined by knowledge and responsibility rather than privilege. After the meal, in the hours before sleep, there is time for maintenance of a different kind. The quiet man works on arrows, straightening shafts that have warped slightly in the changing temperature, checking fletching, testing points. The younger woman and her brother oil the leather of their boots and middens, working the fat into the material to keep it supple, to prevent cracking that would allow cold and moisture to penetrate. The old woman sews, repairing a tear in someone's parka, her needle moving by the firelight with steady precision. The man who taught you to read snow tells a story, speaking quietly, and you understand that this is also a kind of maintenance, the preservation of knowledge, the transmission of understanding. His story is about a winter many years ago, before you were born, when the cold came even harder than this, when it stayed longer, when people had to adapt their shelters in ways they had never done before. He describes how they dug deeper, how they covered the entire structure with ice, how they kept the fire burning continuously for 30 days, rotating sleep so that someone was always awake to feed it. He tells this not to frighten but to instruct, to place the current challenges in context, to remind everyone that what you face now is difficult but not impossible, has been faced before and survived. You listen, and as you listen, you work on your own tools, sharpening a knife, adjusting the binding on an axe handle, and you feel the strange comfort of this scene, people gathered in warmth while outside the darkness holds killing cold, hands busy with work that will enable survival, voices sharing knowledge across time. This is what the shelter makes possible, not just physical survival but the continuation of skill and story, the maintenance of social bonds, the space for thought and planning and the small human acts that define civilization even in the most extreme circumstances. The eldest hunter speaks when the story finishes, adding his own observations, connecting past to present, and you hear in his words the same principle that governed the day's physical work, the importance of margins, of preparation, of attending to small details before they become large problems. He talks about reading the signs that predict the worst cold, the quality of starlight, the behavior of whatever animals remain active, the sound of ice forming on the nearby river, and you commit these signs to memory, adding them to the growing catalog of knowledge you are accumulating. The old woman finishes her sewing and begins preparing the shelter for sleep, banking the fire so it will burn lower and longer, checking that the door curtain hangs properly, ensuring that everyone's sleeping furs are arranged for maximum warmth. You help her, learning the ritual of shelter going dark, understanding that this nightly routine is as important as any of the construction techniques, that survival is as much about practice and consistency as it is about design. One by one, people retreat to their sleeping platforms, arranging themselves in their furs, settling in for the long night. The fire dims to coals that glow deep red in the darkness, providing less light but more sustained heat, and the shelter enters its nighttime state, a quiet, dark, warm space where 7 people sleep while outside the temperature drops to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. You lie in your furs, feeling the warmth of the improved sleeping platform beneath you, the warmth of the shelter air around you, and you think about the day's work, about all the small corrections and improvements that have made this warmth possible. You think about the knowledge embedded in every aspect of this structure, from the selection of the building site to the angle of the walls to the layers of insulation to the management of the fire. You think about the generations of people who developed these techniques, who learned through trial and sometimes terrible error what works and what fails, who passed that knowledge down so that you could lie here now, warm and alive, while outside the winter expresses its full power. Sleep comes slowly, drifting in with the same gentle inevitability as snow accumulating on the shelter's roof. In the dimness, you can just make out the shape of the structure around you, the curved walls, the central posts, the smoke hole above with its faint suggestion of stars beyond. The breathing of the others creates a soft rhythm, and beneath that, almost inaudible, is the slight creak and tick of the shelter itself, wood and hide adjusting to temperature, the sounds of materials holding firm against the cold. You wake once in the deepest part of night, disturbed by some small sound or perhaps by nothing at all, and in the absolute darkness you feel rather than see the shelter around you. The warmth is still here, unchanged, reliable, and you understand with a clarity that comes only in such moments that this maintenance of life-sustaining temperature in a lethal environment, is perhaps humanity's first and most essential technology. Before writing, before agriculture, before wheels or metal or any of the innovations that would later define civilization, there was this, the creation of warm space in cold places, the building of shelter that holds back death. You sleep again, and this time you do not wake until morning, when the old woman rises in the darkness and begins the quiet work of reviving the fire. The cycle begins again, day following night, warmth defended against cold, life maintained through knowledge and labor and the careful application of principles learned over countless winters. The fire grows, light spreading across the shelter's interior, and you emerge from your furs into air that is cold but not dangerous, into a space that has held through the night, into another day of survival made possible by the accumulated wisdom of strangers who lived and died long before you were born, who figured out through necessity and observation and careful thought how to build a shelter that retains heat, that protects life, that stands between the fragile human body and the winters. Absolute indifference. The eldest hunter stirs, and before he even opens his eyes, he is assessing, measuring, evaluating the shelter's performance through the hardest night yet. When he finally rises, he moves to the walls, running his hands along them, checking for frost, for cold spots, for any sign of failure in the defenses you all worked so hard to perfect yesterday. He finds nothing concerning. The improvements have held. The shelter has done its work. He nods, once, and speaks a single word, good. And in that word you hear everything, approval, relief, acknowledgement of the labor invested, confirmation that the knowledge has been correctly applied, that the margins are sufficient, that you will all survive to face another day, another night, another test of your small fortress against the winter's siege. You wake before dawn on the final morning of construction, and the cold has changed its character. It no longer feels like an adversary pressing against the walls but rather a distant presence, acknowledged and held at bay. The fire in the central hearth has burned through the night, tended in shifts, and now exists as a bed of coals so deep and red they seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. You rise slowly, feeling the stiffness in your shoulders and back, the honest ache of work completed, and you move through the dimness toward the entrance. The sky beyond the tunnel is beginning to pale, that particular gray-blue that precedes true dawn in winter landscapes, and you step outside into air so still it feels like walking into a held breath. The camp around you has taken its final form. What began as scattered materials and ancient knowledge carried in memory has become something solid and real, a constellation of structures designed with singular purpose, to preserve the fragile warmth of human life against the indifferent cold of the season. You walk the perimeter slowly, your boots crunching on snow that has been packed down by weeks of footsteps, and you see the work with fresh eyes. The main dwelling sits at the heart of the arrangement, its rounded form now completely covered in the final layer of snow blocks, each seam packed tight with loose snow that has frozen into seamless continuity. The entrance tunnel extends outward and downward, and from this angle you can see how deliberately it was positioned, angled away from the prevailing winds, its curve designed to trap cold air in the lowest section before it can reach the living space within. Around the main structure, the smaller shelters and storage caches form a protective circle, each one built with the same attention to thermal principles, each one a lesson in how heat moves and how it can be held. The smoke hole at the apex of the main dwelling releases a thin column of vapor into the pale sky, barely visible, and you know this means the fire is burning clean and hot, the ventilation working exactly as it should, drawing fresh air through the entrance tunnel and allowing smoke to escape without surrendering too much warmth in the process. You walk to the nearest cache, a smaller dome used for storing meat and skins, and you run your hand along its surface. The snow has settled and compacted, transforming from the loose powder that first fell to something denser, more structural, and you can feel how the outer surface has been glazed by cycles of slight melting and refreezing, creating a shell that is almost ice-like in its hardness. This is what time does to a winter camp, you think. It refines it. The weather itself becomes part of the construction, sealing and strengthening what human hands have built. Behind you, others are emerging from the main dwelling, moving quietly into the early morning, and you hear the soft sounds of the camp coming to life, the crunch of footsteps, the low murmur of voices, the scrape of a shovel clearing yesterday's drift from the entrance. There is a sense of completion in the air, a collective understanding that the work of building is finished and the work of living can truly begin. You have created, together, a place where warmth can be preserved through the long darkness, where the fire can burn continuously without consuming impossible quantities of fuel, where the structure itself conspires to hold heat close. You think about the first night, how the cold seemed absolute and the task impossible, and you compare it to now, this moment of arrival, and you understand that what you have built is not just physical shelter but a kind of knowledge made manifest. Every choice, from the height of the walls to the angle of the roof, from the depth of the entrance to the placement of the sleeping platforms, represents generations of observation and refinement. The people who first learned these techniques did so through necessity and experimentation, through cold nights and lost heat, through the patient accumulation of understanding about how warmth behaves and how it can be kept. You return to the entrance and descend into the tunnel, feeling the temperature shift as you move downward and inward. The tunnel is doing its work invisibly, constantly, creating a thermal lock between the bitter air outside and the carefully maintained warmth within. The cold air that enters stays low, pooling in the deepest part of the curve, while the warm air inside remains elevated, separated by this simple but elegant design. No door is needed, no flap or barrier that might tear or fail. The architecture itself creates the seal. Inside, the dwelling has taken on the character of a lived space. The sleeping platforms are arranged with furs and woven mats, personal items have found their places in the niches carved into the walls, and the central hearth radiates its steady heat into every corner. The walls, which began as mere blocks of snow, have been transformed by interior warmth into something almost glassy, their inner surfaces slightly melted and refrozen into a smooth finish that reflects the firelight in subtle glimmers. This transformation is part of the design, you know. The slight melting creates a thin layer of ice that actually insulates better than snow alone, and it seals any remaining gaps between blocks, making the structure even more airtight. You settle near the fire and extend your hands toward its warmth, and someone passes you a cup of hot tea, the steam rising in visible spirals. The person who hands it to you is the elder who first shared the knowledge of snow cutting, and though their face is weathered by years and cold, their eyes hold a quiet satisfaction. They sit beside you without speaking at first, both of you watching the flames, and then they say, "It will hold. Through the worst of the season, it will hold." You nod, knowing this is true, knowing it not as hope but as certainty born from understanding. The camp has been built according to principles that have proven themselves across countless winters, across different lands and different peoples who all faced the same fundamental challenge: how to preserve warmth when fuel is precious and the cold is relentless. The answer, you have learned, lies not in fighting the cold with brute force but in understanding how heat moves and then building structures that work with those natural laws rather than against them. The elder begins to speak about other camps they have known, other winters survived, and their voice falls into the rhythm of story. They tell of a winter when they were young, when the snow fell so deeply that the entrance tunnels had to be extended twice, dug forward into new drifts, and how the dwelling inside remained warm throughout, the architecture adapting to conditions while maintaining its essential function. They tell of a season when fuel was scarce, when every piece of wood or dung had to be carefully rationed, and how the efficient design of the hearth and the insulation of the walls made it possible to maintain livable temperatures with fires that would have been inadequate in any other structure. You listen, and others gather to listen as well, forming a loose circle around the fire, and in this moment you understand that the camp you have built is part of a continuum, a link in a long chain of winter dwellings that stretches back through time. The techniques you have used are not inventions but inheritances, passed down through teaching and practice, refined by necessity, proven by survival. Each generation adds its own small refinements, its own observations, but the core principles remain constant because they are rooted in the unchanging physics of heat and cold, insulation and ventilation, shelter and survival. As the elder's story winds down, another person begins to speak, someone younger, who tells of their first winter camp, of mistakes made and lessons learned. They describe building walls too thin, not understanding the importance of mass in snow construction, and how the cold penetrated despite their best efforts. They describe learning to read the snow, to test its consistency, to know by touch and sight which snow will cut into firm blocks and which will crumble. Their story is one of apprenticeship, of knowledge earned through experience, and it reminds everyone present that skill is not innate but cultivated. The morning progresses around these stories, around this gathering near the fire, and outside the light strengthens into full day, though inside the dwelling the illumination remains constant, the soft glow of flames supplemented by the thin winter sunlight that filters through the translucent smoke hole. You feel a deep contentment, a sense that something important has been accomplished. The camp is more than shelter, it is a testament to human ingenuity, to the ability to observe and learn, to adapt and create solutions to environmental challenges. You think about the children who will grow up in places like this, who will learn these skills as naturally as they learn to walk and speak, and you think about the knowledge being transmitted not just through words but through participation, through the physical act of cutting and stacking and packing, through the sensory experience of feeling how different snows behave, of understanding cold not as an abstract concept but as a tangible presence that must be managed. This is how traditions survive, you realize. Not through preservation in museums or recording in books, but through continuous practice, through the living transmission of skill and understanding from one generation to the next. Someone brings out food, simple fare made rich by the context of warmth and safety, and the meal is shared in comfortable quiet, punctuated by occasional conversation. The mood is contemplative rather than celebratory, a collective acknowledgement of work completed and the long season ahead. There will be storms, you all know. There will be days when the wind howls and visibility drops to nothing, when the cold presses close despite all precautions. But you will face those days from within this structure, from within this carefully constructed envelope of warmth, and that makes all the difference. After the meal, you step outside again, and this time others join you. Together you walk through the camp, inspecting each structure, checking seals and ventilation, making minor adjustments. One person notices a small gap where wind has eroded snow from between blocks, and they pack it tight with fresh snow, smoothing it carefully. Another checks the smoke hole, ensuring the opening is clear, that ice has not built up around the edges where warm air meets cold. These are the maintenance tasks that will become routine, the small acts of attention that keep the camp functioning optimally throughout the season. You walk to the edge of the camp where the storage caches stand, and you kneel beside one to examine how the platform inside keeps the stored items elevated above the floor. This detail, seemingly small, is crucial for preservation. The coldest air settles lowest, creating a natural refrigeration that keeps meat frozen without any active cooling needed. The platform ensures that this cold air can circulate beneath the stored items, surrounding them in temperature that arrests decay. It is another example of design working with natural forces, using the behavior of cold air to advantage rather than fighting against it. As you stand, you notice the angle of the sun, how low it remains even at midday, and you think about the mathematics of daylight in winter, how the hours of darkness far outnumber the hours of light this far north. The camp, you realize, has been designed not just for thermal efficiency but for psychological survival as well. The central hearth provides not only warmth but light and a focal point for gathering. The arrangement of sleeping platforms creates defined personal spaces within the communal structure, offering both togetherness and privacy. The very act of maintaining the fire, of tending it through the night in shifts, creates rhythm and purpose, tasks that mark time and give structure to the long darkness. You return to the main dwelling and descend once more into the warm interior, and you settle on one of the platforms with your back against the wall. The ice-glazed surface is cold at first touch but quickly warms where your body contacts it, and you feel how the platform itself, raised above the floor, positions you in the warmest zone of the structure. This is intentional, you know. Heat rises, and the platforms take advantage of this, placing the sleeping areas in the thermal layer where warm air accumulates, above the colder air that settles near the floor but below the smoke that rises to escape through the roof vent. Someone begins to work nearby, sewing something by the firelight, their needle moving in steady rhythm, and the quiet domestic sound is soothing. Another person is sharpening a tool, the soft rasp of stone on metal adding its own rhythm to the space. These sounds, these small productive activities, fill the dwelling with life, and you realize that the camp has become what it was always meant to be, not just a structure but a home, a place where life continues despite the hostility of the environment beyond the walls. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the layers of sound, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind outside, the human sounds of movement and work and breathing. When you open them again, you look up at the dome of the ceiling, following the spiral of smoke blocks up to the apex where firelight flickers against ice-glazed snow, and you marvel at the simplicity and effectiveness of the design. No complex materials, no advanced technology, just snow and knowledge and skill combined to create something that functions beautifully within its context. The afternoon wears on, and people come and go through the entrance tunnel, bringing in items from the caches, venturing out briefly for necessary tasks, always returning to the warmth. You notice how smoothly the thermal lock functions, how the brief opening of the entrance to the outside air does not noticeably chill the interior. The tunnel does its work, the heated air remains elevated, and the structure maintains its temperature through these small disruptions. This is the test of good design, you think, not performance under ideal conditions but resilience under real use. As evening approaches, someone begins to prepare food over the fire, and rich smells fill the dwelling. The warmth of cooking adds to the ambient heat, and you feel the temperature rise slightly, comfortably, as steam from the pot ascends toward the smoke hole. The ventilation adjusts naturally, drawing more strongly as the heat increases, maintaining air quality without conscious intervention. It is a responsive system, you realize, not static but dynamic, adapting to changing conditions within its design parameters. The meal is ready, and once again food is shared around the fire, and once again the mood is one of quiet contentment. There is conversation, but it is unhurried, wandering from topic to topic without urgency. Someone asks about the weather tomorrow, and several people offer predictions based on the sky they saw at dusk, the feel of the air, the behavior of smoke from the fire. Weather reading is another skill crucial to winter survival, and even in casual conversation, knowledge is being shared and reinforced. After the meal, as people settle into their evening positions, you find yourself thinking about the broader patterns of which this camp is a part. You think about other groups in other places facing different but parallel challenges, developing their own solutions based on available materials and local conditions. In forests, winter camps might be built with logs and bark, with different strategies for insulation and heat retention. In mountains, stone and sod might form the primary materials. But everywhere, the underlying principles remain: understand how heat moves, create barriers to its loss, design ventilation that maintains air quality without surrendering warmth, use local materials in ways that work with rather than against their natural properties. You think about the sharing of knowledge between groups, the way techniques travel through trade and interaction, how a successful innovation in one place might be adapted for use in another, modified to fit different circumstances but carrying the same core insight. The camp you sit in represents not isolated invention but collective learning, the accumulated wisdom of many peoples across many winters, all contributing to the store of human knowledge about survival and comfort in cold climates. Someone begins to sing, softly, a melody that seems designed for this kind of space, for firelight and warmth and the gathered presence of others. The song is wordless, just a rising and falling of notes, and others join in with harmonies, and the sound fills the dome and seems to warm it further, though you know this is psychological rather than physical. Still, it matters. Warmth is not only a measure of temperature but a quality of atmosphere, a sense of safety and community that goes beyond mere physics. The song fades gradually into silence, and people begin to prepare for sleep, banking the fire carefully so it will burn low and steady through the night, arranging furs and blankets on the platforms, settling into the positions they have claimed. You remain awake a little longer, watching the firelight play across the curved ceiling, thinking about the work completed and the season ahead. There will be challenges, you know. No shelter is perfect, no preparation complete. But you have done what can be done, built what should be built, created a place where warmth can be preserved and life can continue. You think about the morning, about waking to another day in this place, about the routines that will develop, the rhythms of winter living. There will be work, maintaining the camp, managing supplies, hunting when conditions allow, processing skins and repairing gear. There will be storytelling and teaching, games and crafts, all the activities that fill the long hours of darkness. And through it all, the fire will burn and the walls will hold and the cold will remain outside, acknowledged but defeated. As sleep begins to claim you, you feel the warmth rising from the platform beneath you, the warmth held in the furs around you, the warmth radiating from the fire at the center of the space. All these sources of heat are working together, preserved by the structure that contains them, and you understand with complete clarity that this is the achievement, not merely building walls but creating a system, an architecture that works holistically to maintain the conditions for human survival and comfort. Your last waking thought is of gratitude, though to whom or what you cannot quite say. Perhaps to the generations who perfected these techniques. Perhaps to the teachers who shared them. Perhaps to the snow itself, which provides both the threat and the solution, which is both the cold to be endured and the material for enduring it. Perhaps simply to the human capacity for observation and learning, for taking notice of how the world works and finding ways to live within it rather than in opposition to it. The fire burns low, the camp sleeps, and outside the wind rises slightly, testing the walls, finding them solid, moving on across the frozen landscape. Inside, the warmth holds, the temperature remains stable, and the long winter night passes in comfort and safety, exactly as the architecture intended. You wake before dawn on a morning that feels different, though you cannot yet name why. The darkness inside the shelter holds a particular quality, dense and soft at once, and you lie still for a moment, listening. The wind has fallen away completely. No whistle through gaps, no pressure against the outer walls, no creak of poles bearing weight. Just silence, and the measured breathing of those sleeping near you, and the faint residual warmth of banked coals somewhere in the shared darkness. You rise carefully, your body moving with the practiced economy of someone who has learned not to disturb the warmth pocket around your sleeping place. The air on your face feels less severe than it has in weeks. Not warm, never warm at this hour, but softer somehow, as if the cold itself has relaxed its grip just slightly. You feel for the worn path toward the entrance tunnel, your feet finding the way without thought, and you move through the low passage on hands and knees, your breath white in the blackness, your body remembering every turn. When you emerge into the open air, the world has transformed. The storm has passed completely. The sky holds that peculiar clarity that comes after days of snow, a deep blue-black scattered with stars so bright and numerous they seem almost within reach. The eastern horizon shows the first pale suggestion of dawn, a thin line of gray-green light that promises the sun's eventual return. The snow lies deep and undisturbed, its surface crystalline and perfect, and you stand for a long moment simply looking, feeling the quiet settle into your bones. The camp around you is barely visible in the pre-dawn dimness, but you know every structure by heart. The main dwelling with its careful dome, the smaller shelters clustered near it, the storage areas marked by subtle mounds, the pathways that connect everything in patterns of efficiency and purpose. All of it buried now beneath fresh snow, softened and smoothed, but present still, solid and dependable beneath the white. You feel a kind of gratitude rise in your chest, wordless and deep, for the intelligence embedded in every wall and roof, for the accumulated wisdom that has kept everyone safe through the storm's fury. You walk to where the woodpile stands, or where you know it stands beneath its protective covering. The snow has drifted against it, sculpting shapes of surprising grace, and you begin the work of clearing access, moving with slow deliberation. The physical effort feels good after days of confinement, your muscles waking, your blood warming. The sky brightens incrementally as you work, the stars fading one by one, the promise of day becoming certainty. Others begin to emerge from the shelters, moving slowly, speaking in low voices that honor the morning stillness. You exchange nods, small gestures of acknowledgement and shared relief. The storm has passed. Everyone has weathered it. The structures have held. These are facts worth noting, worth feeling, though no one says them aloud. There is simply the quiet resumption of tasks, the communal return to patterns of maintenance and care that have sustained your people through countless winters before this one. You help clear pathways, working alongside others whose names and faces have become as familiar as your own family. The snow is deep but dry, easy to move, and the work progresses with satisfying speed. Someone starts a fire in the open area, feeding it carefully, building it up from small flames to a steady blaze, and gradually people gather around it, drawn by the warmth and the light and the simple pleasure of being able to stand upright beneath an open sky after so many days enclosed. The sun rises slowly, its light spreading across the snow-covered land in shades of pink and gold and pale amber. You watch it climb, feeling its light on your face even though its warmth will take hours yet to register. The world around you reveals itself incrementally, the line of trees to the north, their branches heavy with snow, the open expanse to the south, rolling white toward distant hills, the frozen surface of the water source, marked and known, the far landmarks that anchor your sense of place and direction. Everything familiar, everything where it should be, everything enduring. You return to the main shelter to help prepare the morning meal, moving through the entrance tunnel with the ease of long practice, emerging into the interior warmth that feels almost luxurious after the outside air. The coals from last night still glow faintly in their stone-lined pit, and you add fuel carefully, building the fire up again, watching the flames catch and spread. The light fills the space gradually, revealing faces and hands and the small domestic order of your shared life. The meal is simple but satisfying, dried meat softened in hot water, preserved berries, fat rendered and mixed with ground seeds. You eat slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the stores that make such meals possible, aware of the work that went into harvesting and preparing and storing everything that now sustains you. The others eat with the same attention, the same quiet appreciation. Conversation flows in low murmurs, occasional soft laughter, comfortable silences. The shelter holds all of it easily, the warmth and the voices and the sense of security, its walls and roof and floor working in concert to create this pocket of survivable space in a landscape that does not naturally support such comfort. Later, you join a group that sets out to check the outlying storage areas, to make sure nothing has been compromised by the storm. You walk through snow that reaches your knees in places, following paths that exist more in memory than in visible reality. The air is still cold, sharp in your lungs, but without the wind it feels manageable, even pleasant in its clarity. The sky stretches vast and blue above you, and your breath forms clouds that dissipate slowly in the crystalline air. Each storage pit is carefully uncovered, checked, and sealed again. Everything is intact. The meat caches frozen solid, the tubers and roots secure in their underground chambers, the fuel supplies adequate for the weeks still ahead. You feel the satisfaction of preparation validated, of work done properly in autumn now proving its worth in the depth of winter. Each decision made months ago, each hour spent gathering and processing and storing, has contributed to this moment of sufficiency, this knowledge that there is enough. You stop at one point on the return journey, looking back toward the camp. From this distance, the shelters are barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape, organic mounds that could be natural features of the terrain. Only the thin line of smoke rising from the main dwelling marks human presence, a gray thread against the blue sky, a signal of warmth and habitation. You think about how the design achieves this, how the low profiles and earth-covered walls blend into the land while providing maximum protection, how the camps of your people have always understood the value of working with the environment rather than against it. As you stand there, the wind begins to pick up slightly, a gentle movement of air from the west, and you taste it instinctively, reading it for signs. It carries moisture, a hint of change coming, but nothing immediate, nothing threatening. Just the slow wheel of weather patterns, the endless cycle of fronts and systems that define winter in this place. You have learned to read these signs over years of attention, taught by elders who learned from their own teachers, a chain of observation and interpretation stretching back through generations. The knowledge lives in you now, not as facts memorized but as instinct integrated, part of how you move through the world. Back at the camp, you join the ongoing work of maintenance. There is always something that needs tending, always some small adjustment or repair that will improve comfort or efficiency. You help repack snow around the base of one shelter where wind has eroded it, working the snow carefully, pressing it firm, building up the insulation that keeps warmth from bleeding away into the earth. Your hands grow cold, but the work itself generates heat, and you settle into the rhythm of it, the repetitive motions that allow your mind to wander while your body performs tasks it knows by heart. You think about the season's passage, about the weeks still ahead before the land begins its slow tilt toward spring. Long weeks, cold weeks, but manageable now that the worst of winter's early storms have passed. The shelters will hold. The food will last. The community will sustain itself through the accumulated wisdom of its building practices and the careful implementation of principles tested across countless winters. You are not merely surviving, you realize. You are living deliberately, inhabiting space that has been shaped with intelligence and care, warmed by fires that carry symbolic weight beyond their practical heat. The afternoon passes in quiet industry. Some work on tool maintenance, sharpening blades, repairing handles, making cordage from stored fibers. Others attend to clothing, checking seams, reinforcing weak spots, making sure everyone has adequate protection for the cold that persists despite the clear sky. Children play in the snow under watchful eyes, their voices carrying on the still air, their energy a reminder that life continues, that this season is not an ending but a passage, necessary and natural. You spend time with the eldest members of the community, listening as they talk about winters past, their voices soft and measured, their stories not dramatic tales but quiet recollections of small details, how snow fell in a particular year, how ice formed patterns on a certain lake, how the light looked on a morning much like this one decades ago. Their memories are vast repositories of weather knowledge, of seasonal patterns, of the subtle variations that distinguish one winter from another. You listen carefully, understanding that this knowledge will be yours to carry eventually, yours to pass on when your own seasons turn toward age. As evening approaches, the temperature begins to drop again, the clear sky offering no insulation against the cold radiating up from the snow and down from the atmosphere. You help prepare the shelters for night, banking fires carefully, arranging sleeping spaces for maximum warmth efficiency, making sure everyone has adequate covering. The work has become second nature, a series of small precise actions that collectively create the conditions for safe rest. The meal that evening is communal and unhurried, everyone gathering in the main shelter, the space warm and dim and filled with the quiet sounds of shared eating. The fire burns steady in its pit, the smoke drawing up and out through the carefully designed opening, the light playing across faces and walls. You eat slowly, aware of the taste and texture of the food, aware of the warmth of the shelter around you, aware of the presence of others whose survival is bound up with your own in these months of cold and darkness. After the meal, someone begins to sing, a low melodic line that others gradually join, voices blending in harmonies that have been refined over generations. The song is not about winter specifically, but about endurance, about the cycles of season and life, about the knowledge that difficult times pass and green returns eventually to the land. You add your voice to the others, feeling the vibrations in your chest, feeling the way the shelter's curved walls gather and amplify the sound, creating resonance that fills the space completely. The singing continues for a long time, one song flowing into another, the tempo remaining slow and steady, conducive to the deep rest that everyone needs. The warmth and the music and the dimming light combine to create a profound sense of ease, and you feel yourself relaxing completely, all the accumulated tension of the storm days releasing finally, leaving you loose and peaceful. When the singing eventually fades into silence, no one moves immediately. You sit together in the warm dimness, breathing in unison, sharing the stillness. Outside, the winter night is sharp and clear and very cold, but here, in this carefully constructed space, there is warmth and safety and the quiet knowledge that human ingenuity has created a place where life can persist even in the hardest season. You think about the engineering of it all, though you would not use that word. You think about how every element of the shelter works in concert, the low profile presenting minimal resistance to wind, the earth walls providing thermal mass that stabilizes interior temperature, the entrance tunnel preventing direct air exchange, the careful sizing that balances occupancy heat with manageable space, the ventilation system that allows smoke to exit while preventing excessive heat loss, the packed snow adding temporary but significant insulation, the sleeping platforms, raising bodies above the coldest air, the communal arrangement allowing people to share warmth efficiently. You think about how this knowledge emerged, not from single moments of brilliance but from countless small observations and adjustments made over generations, each winter teaching something, each failure prompting modification, each success being remembered and replicated and refined. The shelters you occupy tonight represent hundreds of years of accumulated wisdom, distilled into practices so effective they have become cultural constants, so integrated into your people's way of life that they feel less like techniques and more like natural law. Eventually, people begin to settle into sleeping spaces, arranging furs and hides, positioning themselves in patterns learned through experience. You find your place, the spot you have occupied for weeks now, and you lie down, feeling the warmth radiating up from below and across from nearby bodies, feeling the shelter's envelope of protection around you. The fire burns lower, subsiding into coals, but the warmth it has generated remains, held by the thermal mass of earth and stone, released gradually through the night. In the darkness, you hear the small sounds of the shelter settling, the shift of someone turning, the faint crackle of coals, the whisper of breath, the distant creak of frozen wood somewhere outside. These are the sounds of winter habitation, familiar and reassuring, confirmation that all is well, that the systems are working, that the night will pass safely. You close your eyes, feeling sleep begin to rise like a gentle tide, and in that liminal space between waking and dreams, you experience a moment of profound clarity. You see the shelter not just as physical structure but as embodiment of relationship between people and land, between present and past, between immediate need and long-term sustainability. The camps built for maximum heat retention are not merely clever solutions to thermal challenges. They are expressions of a fundamental understanding that survival in harsh environments requires humility, observation, cooperation, and the willingness to learn from the land itself. The cold teaches, you think, hovering at the edge of sleep. It teaches efficiency and economy. It teaches the value of preparation, of community, of accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. It teaches respect for natural forces and appreciation for small comforts. It teaches that warmth is not just a physical phenomenon but a condition created through attention and care, through the careful arrangement of materials and space, through the willingness to work together towards shared survival. Sleep takes you gradually, pulling you down into rest, and the shelter holds you through the night, its walls and roof and floor working silently, continuously, maintaining the envelope of survivable space that makes sleep itself possible. Outside, the temperature drops to levels that would kill an unprepared person within hours. Inside, the carefully managed thermal environment sustains life comfortably, the temperature never warm by summer standards but adequate, stable, safe. You dream, though you will not remember the details upon waking. You dream of snow and fire, of walls that breathe, of warmth that spreads in invisible waves, of hands building and shaping and perfecting, of voices singing in the darkness, of survival transformed into art through the patient application of knowledge and care. The night passes. The fire burns down to ash and a few persistent coals. The temperature inside the shelter drops slightly but remains well above the brutal cold outside. The thermal mass releases its stored warmth gradually, exactly as designed, exactly as it has done for countless nights across countless winters. The shelters endure because they are based on principles that cannot be argued with: physics and thermodynamics, observation and testing, failure and refinement. Toward dawn, you surface briefly into half-consciousness, aware of the pre-dawn darkness, aware of warmth and safety, aware that another night has passed successfully. You do not fully wake. You simply register these facts and sink back into sleep, trusting the structure around you, trusting the knowledge embedded in its design, trusting the community whose collective effort maintains all of it. When you do finally wake, it is to the same carefully managed transition you have experienced every morning, gradual awareness, slow return to full consciousness, minimal thermal shock. The shelter has held through the night. Everyone is safe. The day begins again with small tasks and quiet purpose, with the ongoing work of maintaining warmth and ensuring survival, with the endless subtle adjustments that allow human life to persist in a landscape that does not naturally welcome it. You rise and begin again, moving through the familiar sequence of morning tasks, and as you work, you carry with you the knowledge that has sustained your people through uncounted winters, the knowledge of how to read weather and land, how to gather and store and conserve, how to build structures that work with natural forces rather than against them, how to create warmth not just through fire but through intelligent design and communal cooperation. The camps built for maximum heat retention stand around you, low and unassuming, their curved walls covered in snow, their interiors warm and dim and full of quiet human presence. They are not monuments to human dominance over nature but evidence of human ability to observe, to learn, to adapt, to create sustainable solutions to existential challenges. They are home, for now, for these months of cold and darkness, and they are enough. You step outside into the morning cold, feeling it on your face and hands, feeling the difference between interior and exterior, feeling the gift of being able to move between them, to have refuge, to have warmth waiting when you need it. The sun is rising again, its light spreading across the snow, beginning another day in the endless cycle of days that makes up a winter, makes up a life. You breathe the cold air deeply, feeling it sharp and clean in your lungs, and you look across the camp, across the shelters that have held through storms and calm alike, across the visible evidence of human intelligence applied to the fundamental problem of survival. You feel gratitude, not abstract or sentimental but concrete and immediate, for the knowledge that built these walls, for the hands that shaped them, for the community that maintains them, for the land that provides the materials, for the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned these lessons before passing them on. The day stretches ahead, full of small necessary tasks, of maintenance and preparation, of ongoing vigilance and care. The winter stretches ahead, weak still before the turn toward spring, before the ice breaks and the snow melts and the land transforms once again. But you are ready. Your people are ready. The shelters are sound, the stores adequate, the knowledge intact and living. You will endure this season as your ancestors endured it, through intelligence and cooperation and the careful application of principles learned from the land itself. The wind picks up slightly, moving the smoke from the fire, carrying the cold down from distant mountains and across the frozen expanse toward where you stand. You feel it and read it and accept it, understanding it as part of the system, part of the pattern, part of the great wheel of seasons that turns regardless of human will. You cannot stop the wind or prevent the cold, but you can build walls that shelter against them, create spaces where warmth persists, where life continues, where knowledge accumulates and passes forward. You turn back toward the shelter, toward warmth and community and the quiet ongoing work of winter living. You carry with you the understanding that has sustained your people, that survival is not accidental but achieved through attention and effort, through respect for natural law and willingness to work with it rather than against it, through the careful preservation and transmission of knowledge that each generation refines and passes on. The shelter's entrance tunnel welcomes you, low and dark and leading toward warmth. You enter it on hands and knees, your body knowing the way without thought, and you move through the passage that stands between cold and warm, between exposure and protection, between the unmodified world and the carefully shaped space where human life persists. You emerge into the shelter's warmth, into dim light and the soft sounds of morning activity, into the ongoing present moment that contains all of winter's accumulated wisdom. You take your place among the others, adding your effort to the collective work, contributing your knowledge to the shared understanding, participating in the ancient and ongoing practice of winter survival in a landscape of cold and beauty and profound challenge. The fire burns steady. The walls hold firm. The warmth surrounds you, generated by flame and design and the thermal wisdom embedded in every element of the structure. Outside, winter continues its patient work, shaping snow and ice and the bones of the land. Inside, human life continues its equally patient work, maintaining warmth and safety and the conditions for survival. This is the knowledge built into the camps constructed for maximum heat retention, Not just the technical understanding of how to trap and preserve warmth, but the deeper wisdom of how to live sustainably in challenging places, how to observe and learn and adapt, how to build community and preserve knowledge, how to respect natural forces while creating space for human flourishing within their constraints. You sit in the warm dimness, feeling the shelter around you, feeling the season continuing its slow passage, feeling yourself part of a chain of people stretching back through time and forward into an unknown but not unimaginable future. The shelters will stand as long as they are needed. The knowledge will persist as long as it is valued and taught and practiced. The warmth will endure as long as people attend to its maintenance with intelligence and care. The morning settles into its rhythm. Work continues. Time passes. Winter holds the land in its grip, patient and absolute, and the camps built against its cold stand firm, warm, inhabited, alive with the quiet persistence of human presence in an ungenerous season. This is enough. This has always been enough. This will be enough for as long as the knowledge endures and the hands remain willing and the attention stays focused on the essential work of creating and maintaining warmth in a cold world.